Hi everybody, my name is Rongrong. I'm a software engineer working on Presto in Facebook. And today I will be talking about Presto SQL functions and in general function support in Presto. So first off, big news, SQL invoked function is actually available in Presto to use. If you use the latest version of Presto, I think it's probably available since 2.31-ish, but we are doing improvements every release still. So there would be potentially changes and potentially not backward compatible changes. So if you're brave enough, you can give it a try. I think it's mostly stable now. We are probably still going to do some small features and bug fixes. If you have any issues, let us know. I will talk in detail about how to use this later. And we are also working on trying to support remote functions. This is basically the case that, well, there are some Java functions, or like even if you want to write Java function or write a function, there are some cases that it's not safe to run it in Presto because, for example, it's calling external service, or it's too slow, or it's like too expensive for all these kind of reasons. Or there might be cases that you have some business logic written in other languages that, well, we just can't run them in JVM. So that's what we're trying to solve. So agenda today, I'll talk in detail about if you want to try SQL function, how to set it up and how to use it. And I'll give an update on the remote function support, and let me know if you have any questions. Okay, how to set it up. There is actually there is documentation in the online docs on how to set up function namespace managers. I'll talk later about what is function namespace manager and what is function namespace. But here's the link. And I basically took a screenshot. It's quite easy to set it up. One thing is the default implementation of a function namespace manager requires a MySQL database server. So if you want to use this version, you need to have MySQL available. If you want to have an additional implementation, function namespace manager is somewhat similar to a connector API. It's a different API. If you implement this API in a plugin, you can have a different implementation of this as well. Basically, you kind of need to wrap up, like you need to have external storage to store your function implementations and function metadata, because this will not be part of the Presto code base. So quite easy to set up. You need to specify what are the function namespaces this function namespace manager is supporting, and which table it's storing the actual functions. So what is a function namespace, or what is a function namespace manager? So function namespace is kind of like, if you are writing in any other programming language, it's that kind of concept. It's basically a dotted notation that would like wrap like some functionality or some objects as a separate packaging, sort of that kind of idea. But mapping to the SQL world, we actually don't have arbitrarily long dot notation for function namespace. So basically a function namespace is kind of a catalog dot schema. So each catalog dot schema can potentially be a function namespace. And a function namespace manager is basically a piece of software or a plugin that would manage a set of these catalog schemas. We decided to have introduced catalog.schema is basically catalog kind of maps to a connector in Presto. So you can have like a Hive connector with the name Hive, or you can have a Hive connector with the name MyHive. So that would be your catalog, and schema is kind of like the internal concept of that. Or like if you can have a MySQL catalog with a MySQL database as the schema. we decided to separate this from the connector API because we want the flexibility of separating this catalog schema from like your Hive or MySQL tables, because essentially, if we're talking about SQL functions, these functions are implemented in SQL, which means that they don't need to be tied to specific table sets, right? Like in normal sense, catalog.schema has tables in them. And these can be Hive tables, these can be MySQL tables, these can be your other like connector tables. But the functions doesn't have to only work for that catalog schema, which is why we sort of separated it as a different plugin API. So this is basically how you would write a SQL function. It's a SQL standard syntax: create function, function name, and then you have the input parameter list with input name and input parameter type, right? This is a list, so you can have additional inputs as well. And then you have the return type. So what is the type of this the return value of this function? These are all scalar functions. So you would return always a single value for a single input. And you can have comments. Comment is not SQL standard, but I think it's in general quite useful for users to understand what does this function do. And show functions would actually include this comment. So it's easier for people to discover these functions. We need to specify call convention. It's either returns null or null input or called on null input. This basically decides whether the function will be invoked if the input is null or input contains null. Whether the function is deterministic, some optimization rules would be based on this, whether we can or cannot optimize certain expressions. And then this is the function body. Currently, the only type of function body we support is expression. So basically, you do return expression. So this function did an array sum. Basically, it's using the reduce to calculate the sum of the arrays. So essentially, what currently SQL function can offer is wrapping SQL logic in the function, which in a way sort of works like a macro. So instead of writing, like one of the really powerful thing of Presto is that you can write very complex lambda functions. But it's actually make the query quite hard to read, and it's very hard to share these lambda function logic, and you basically copy paste the code everywhere. And so this way you can define the complex lambda functions into a SQL function and people can just use it. So this is how you would use SQL function. You need to refer to the function as the catalog.schema.function name. We decided to go with this fully qualified name convention because so potentially we can do that if you just say select array sum. We can just like go through all the catalogs and see whether any function namespace manager has a function that called array sum, and then depending on some ordering, deciding which one to use. But in reality, this kind of makes things a little bit hard to manage in the sense that, for example, I'm writing select array sum, which would resolve to my array sum today. And someone else introduced a new array sum function on another function namespace that has a higher priority than mine. And then like I would just arbitrarily start to use a different function without me knowing. It's kind of like more like a hazard for DBA, so which is mapping Facebook. Our team is both the DBA and the DBeng. So we figured that we don't want to get in there. But that said, if people think this is useful to have like a kind of like a resolution logic and kind of using a fuzzy match and find the best candidate. PRs are welcome as long as you can make sure that this feature can be turned on and off, right? So contributions are welcome. We can do that as well. So this is kind of how underlying the thing works. So first, because you can create a function and actually you can modify the function after it's created. So as a result, the function can, like, unlike built-in functions, which are registered and can never be changed for the lifetime of the server runtime, these functions can change while the server is running. As a result, it's very important that when we're running a single query, we're always using a consistent version of the function to run a single query. How we do this is we make sure that we are only resolving a function once when we are parsing the query on the coordinator. And once the function is resolved, it's resolving to a version of the function. So this function ID would include a version number. And this information would be passed to all workers, and worker will use this function ID to retrieve the function implementation. That way we'll make sure that all the workers are using the same version of the function when it's running a single query. So there, as I said, this is still like actively working in progress. There are still features that's like coming up in the near future, like in the next month or so. One thing is built-in SQL function. One thing you would ask is array sum is a generic logic that like nobody would imagine array sum would need a different implementation. And why do people need to define an array sum and write it to a different function namespace to use it? This can be just the same as built-in functions, except that instead of written in Java, they're written in SQL. So that's what we're working on right now. So there's actually a PR out already, need to be reviewed. What this does is that it allows built-in SQL functions. Built-in functions can still be used as just the function name. So you can, if array sum is a built-in function, that would mean that you can do select array sum array instead of select example.task.array. So like without the fully qualified name, you can still just use it. So, and also that would mean that this function cannot be changed or modified. So that's one thing. Another thing is currently the access control, we don't really have a real access control for functions. So you cannot say that, you cannot grant people permission on write or read or modification on specific functions or specific function like namespaces. So we want to implement access control for functions as well. So these are the specific feature that's coming up in the near future for SQL functions. Of course, we want to also expand SQL function to support not just expression, but more complex SQL constructs. That is currently, there's no concrete plan in the near term, like as not in the next couple months. But if anybody's interested in it, let us know, and we can, if you want to contribute on that and help bring that feature into Presto, that will be very welcome as well. Okay, some more updates on remote functions. I'm seeing that people were asking, is it possible to use Hive UDFs in Presto? So the remote function is sort of trying to address that problem. A lot of the Hive UDFs, so first of all, Hive UDF is implemented in a totally different API than Presto, right? So to run that in Presto, we'll need some, like if we run it, if we want to bring that in Presto today, we at least need to depend on that Hive UDF package and then implement a Presto function, and in that wrapper, call the Hive UDF API in a way. if you want to kind of directly reuse the Hive code. But there's additional problem to that. So one thing is that Hive has better like isolation. So as a result, these Hive functions can like be more flexible in terms of what they are calling, what they're using. So like specifically in Facebook, we have Hive functions that would actually call external services. We have Hive functions that would be quite expensive or like unreliable or use a lot of memory. So all of these can happen, which are not safe to bring them directly into Presto. So remote function is basically saying that, okay, these functions would run in a separate JVM remotely, and they can have their own isolation. So from Presto's perspective, I know this function is not going to run in Presto. I would plan accordingly, generate a different plan. And if I have a function namespace manager that has the information of where to send this function to, then from Presto's server's perspective, problem solved, right? You need to implement an additional function, UDF server, to run it. That's a separate problem. Okay, so this is basically how we are addressing Hive UDFs. And so this is roughly what needs to be changed on Presto. Let's say that this testing.test.remote foo is a remote function that needs to run, that cannot be run on Presto. What we need to augment on the Presto side is to say that this remote foo is a remote function. So the function metadata can indicate whether a function can be run local or has to be run remote, right? And then you have this function namespace manager managing this catalog of remote functions that would know that, okay, for remote foo, I need to talk to that cluster. So on the planning side, what needs to happen is, it used to be that this whole expression is bytecode gen and run in a single path in project, but now that cannot happen anymore. I need to break the project into local projection and remote projection. And if they have dependencies, they need to have like different stages of local projections and remote projections. Once we can break the project into local and remote, what we can do is basically, for the local projection, we run as usual. For the remote projection, we basically, currently, the current implementation is using the Thrift connector API, actually. So we're piggybacking on the Thrift connector API. We'll just directly use the Thrift API to say that convert this page to a Thrift page, and invoke that function on that remote server through Thrift, and then get the result back to me. So basically, we would extract the columns that needed to compute this function and send that to a remote UDF server tier. And once that computation is done, the result will be sent back. And then we can proceed to the next operator stage. So this is what is going on right now. Currently, we have a work in progress PR that's on GitHub. So if you want to check it out, feel free to do so. For the UDF server side, we will see whether it's possible to open source something. So on the UDF server side, it's actually the majority of the work is, so there are a few things on the UDF server side. One thing is the executor that can actually run the remote function. Either it will be run the Hive function, or it will be the one, like if you want to have like a Python executor, or if you want to have like other like PHP executors, C++ executors. Those have more dependencies on what functions you want to run, which would be different for every use case. So it's kind of a little bit harder to like, it's not the logic is mostly depending on the functions which are proprietary for each use case. There's another piece of it that's kind of how do you do scheduling, or how do you manage this cluster? Depending on use case, it can be arbitrarily simple or arbitrarily complex. So we will see later, once we have this in production, whether it's useful to, like, what can be open sourced and how useful it is to open source them. But at the very least, we can talk about how we implement them once we have those. Yeah. So that's all for the updates for SQL functions. Any questions are welcome.
Rongram, take a look at the Q&A panel and see if there is anything that's
yeah, so there is one question for whether it's possible to use Hive UDF in Presto directly without re-implementing it. That would be possible once we have UDF, the remote UDF function functionality in Presto. Yeah, and that's, so far that seems to be the only question. And okay, when you say SQL functions are versioned, is this only for execution to ensure single query use the same implementation? Or are you managing versions in MySQL when a function gets updated? So each version, like when you are, so you can actually do replace function as well, which would basically modify the implementation of the function. Each version of this function would be a different record in MySQL. So I'm not exactly sure what do you mean by are you managing versions in MySQL when a function gets updated? So like sort of. So yes, so each version is a new record in MySQL basically, and that way we'll make sure that the older version is still retrievable if a query is resolved to the old version and need to use it to run. For remote, I hope that answers your question. For remote functions, are you planning to start off with Hive, or are you planning to support other database functions? So we are planning to start with Hive functions internally at Facebook, because that's the largest UDF repository we have. Most of the previous UDFs people wrote are in Hive. So yes, we're starting with that. But then like down the road, we also have business need for like PHP functions and C++ function and Python functions. So we also want to explore those. Yes, any other questions?
I think there's one more that came in, and we should perhaps just wrap it with that one from Himanshu.
Is function overloading supported? So yes, a function is so the function is basically the name plus all input parameter types. So as long as the same name, you can have multiple functions with the same name but takes different parameter inputs. One limitation of the SQL function is actually SQL spec doesn't have the concept of generic. So unfortunately, you sort of need to, even if the same implementation can take different input parameter types, you sort of need to define it multiple times with a different input parameter list. Yes, that's all, I think. Okay.
Yeah, I think that seems like it. So I think we are absolutely on time. It's 12:17. Thank you all on behalf of the Presto Outreach Committee. Thank you all for spending this 1 hour with us. I know it's not the same as being in a room together and perhaps enjoying a meal after a meetup, but I guess what we have is what we have, and let's make the best of it. Wish everybody stays healthy during the next couple of months, and stay tuned for more sessions and events coming from us.